Spence from the University of Twente in Enschede, Netherlands. And what I got from his CV is very interesting, or many interesting aspects, but one very striking is that you also write plays or dramas for philosophical problems.
That's right.
I think that's a very interesting idea. Probably could also one day do that for computer games too.
Sure.
So, yeah, your talk will be on moral states of virtual artifacts in computer games.
Thank you. In 2007, when I presented a paper at the conference, the second philosophy of computer games conference in Reggio Emilia, I presented a paper arguing for the moral rights of avatars, and in particular the moral rights of avatars in their own person, not those of their players. Recently, I have written a paper arguing for the moral status of artifacts, teacups, toasters, irons, mobile phones, and that paper is forthcoming in the International Journal of Technology and Human Interaction. Following that paper, I started thinking of whether the argument for the moral status of artifacts could, in some sense, be extended to the moral status, to argue for the moral status of virtual artifacts. And so this particular presentation is still very exploratory. I am a philosopher, a moral philosopher in particular. I don't know as much about computer games as you do, as some of what I have to say may be applicable to some games, but not on others. But that's interesting in itself, because it might point to some interesting difference between different games that perhaps we haven't thought about before. I start off with Floridi's information ethics. Some of you might be familiar with his work. And I argue initially in agreement with him that artifacts, including virtual artifacts, VARTs for short, in computer games can be conceived as informational objects. And hence, artifacts and VARTs can be conceived as moral patients, if not as agents, deserving of some prima facie minimal moral consideration in their own right, and not just in relation to our own interests, but in their own right. They have, in a sense, some minimal intrinsic moral value. Floridi bases his theory of information ethics on the ethics of being. Floridi's information ethics attributes to information objects, sentient as well as non-sentient, a moral status based exclusively on their existence qua being, with a capital B. For Floridi, everything that exists qua being as an information object in what he calls the informational sphere, not just the biosphere, he extends that to the information sphere. Anything that exists as an information object has an intrinsic moral status that renders it worthy of minimal moral respect, independently of our own anthropocentric perspective. In contrast to Floridi, I agree with his conclusion, but not with his reasons. In contrast to Floridi, I argue that VARTs, artifacts, and VARTs, virtual artifacts, as information objects have a moral status not in virtue of their existence qua being, which is problematic. This is what I argue in the forthcoming paper in that journal, but rather because of their, what I call the design in purposive agency, or deeper. I developed the idea of this design purposive agency from an argument by Alan Gewirth, he's an American philosopher at the University of Chicago. The argument from the principle of genetic consistency, very briefly, I won't have time to go into this, is that according to Gewirth, purposive-oriented behavior, this natural property that we have as human beings, and some animals possess it as well, the purposive behavior can confer value in a manner demonstrated, purposive or goal-oriented behavior can confer value, I argue, in contrast to Floridi's theory of being, in a manner demonstrated by Alan Gewirth's argument for the principle of genetic consistency. And according to Gewirth, and this is I defend his argument in a work that was published of mine in 2006, Ethics Within Reason, and his work, Reason and Morality, 1978. His argument essentially is that the necessary conditions of purposive agency, which is basically freedom and well-being, provide a universal foundation, a sufficient universal foundation for the moral status of all purposive agents or patients. According to Gewirth, human only. He argues for human. I have extended his argument to include non-human to the extent that they have purposive agency as well, namely animals and perhaps in the future androids, artificial humans. Now, how can artifacts have a moral status? I mean, we could grant, most of us might be willing to grant that whales and other higher animals, in fact all animals, have some kind of moral status because of, well, in my case, because they have purposive agency, which is a sufficient condition for granting them the moral status. But how can inanimate, non-sentient objects have a moral status? If morality is based on purposive agency, how can artifacts have moral status if they lack purposive agency? Now, extending moral status to non-sentient entities could be accomplished, and this is what I'll try and show, by showing that how non-sentient objects possess, in some sense and to some degree, a form of purposive agency that is value conferring. But how? This is the argument from designing purposive agency or a DIPA. I would want to say that artifacts and other non-sentient information objects have a functional instrumentality, where they do have a functional instrumentality. Things that are designed for a particular purpose. They have, if you like, a built-in purpose that's been put into them by design. They are designed to perform a certain functional role. For example, take a knife. The functional role of a knife is to cut. It has been designed for that purpose in mind, and the functional role of a purpose, or that purpose, is inherently designed in the knife, and as such inheres in the knife unless removed. So the knife has that functional role, whether it's used to cut an apple or not. It will continue to do so unless something is done to the knife to take away that functional role. When used as intended, it will cut according to the purpose for which it has, for which it was designed. Its designing purpose or its deeper. Now take Mark. Mark is somebody who's got a knife, and for no good reason, just absolutely on million whim, destroys the designing purpose of the or functional capacity of the knife to cut. It just makes it blunt. Just felt like it. Now the knife is now blunt. It has lost its functional purpose of cutting. No doubt the knife has been damaged, harmed, if you like, instrumentally, because it has no longer got its functional role of being able to cut. But has it suffered any moral harm, and by whom? Now, extending Gewirth's argument for the principle of generic consistency based on purposive agency, can we not reasonably say that artifacts such as knives with a deeper design purposive agency to carry out a particular function, have to some minimal degree some prima facie rights, call them artificial freedom, art freedom, and art well-being, artificial being, as patients, if not as agents? Can we not say that Mark's knife that was made blunt for no good reason has its art freedom and art well-being unjustifiably violated, and thus suffered not only an instrumental harm, but also a moral harm, qua artifact, worthy of some minimal respect ought to be by virtue of his stipa? Now, if Mark or somebody else had destroyed the knife in order to prevent a murder, given that the murderer was planning to use the knife to kill somebody, we could say that that was a good enough reason to make the knife blunt, and that reason overrode, if you like, the inherent minimal moral worth of the knife. But in this case, destroying the knife for no good reason, I would argue that it's wrong, morally wrong, both instrumentally and morally wrong. Now, Koska says something interesting which seems to support my position. She talks about intrinsic by conditional value, Christine Koska, the American philosopher. X, she says, has an objective and extrinsic but conditional value if X meets the relevant conditions under which it is held to be valuable, and X is also something that is valued for its own sake or as an end, and in addition to its instrumentality as a means. Along with Coast Guard, we can say, or I would like to say, that a knife or any other artifact, including virtual artifacts, I would say, is valued or can be valued partly for its own sake as an end, in addition to its instrumental use as a means for human ends, if certain relevant conditions are met. For example, if the knife can cut well, it's a good knife, it's used for that purpose, and those conditions are provided by its designing purposive agency. Coast Guard claims that the inherent value of an object is only a matter of practical reason. She's a Kantian, don't forget, and not of its ontology. In contrast to Coast Guard and coming closer to Floridi, I want to argue that the value of an artifact is determined partly by its ontology. In my case, is, if you like, its property of purposive agency inherent in human beings and other than animals. It's a natural property. In artifacts, it's an artificial property that's designed into them. So I want to argue that the value of an artifact is determined partly by its ontology, by virtue of its DPA, the artificial equivalent of the natural property of purposive agency, and partly by the reasons we have for holding that artifact valuable. And don't forget, it is the reasons for holding the artifact valuable, those reasons, the valuable reasons that we hold for which we hold the artifact valuable, have been designed in the artifact itself. In the case of the knife, because we value using something to cut, and therefore that value has been designed into the knife. All right, so real morality for virtual artifacts, though. Granted, even we can grant that the argument from DPA, designing for purposive agency, can be applied to real artifacts like knives and caps and mobile phones and cars and aeroplanes, what have you, does it necessarily follow that the same argument can be applied to virtual artifacts, such as virtual swords, virtual buildings in the virtual environments of computer games, such as, for example, the World of Warcraft and Second Life? If somebody destroys a virtual building, even if it belongs to them, in Second Life for no good reason, just on a whim, would that be a bad thing, morally? I would say yes. In principle, yes. Insofar as the moral status of artifacts is based on their designing purposive agency, it makes no ontological or moral difference whether the artifact is real or virtual. If what determines the moral status of something, including human beings, animals, and artifacts, is their purposive agency. In the case of human beings and other sentient beings, it's natural. In the case of artifacts, it's designed in. If that is a sufficient condition for granting these things moral status, why does it make any difference whether the artifact that possesses an artificial designing purposive agency what difference does it make if it's real or virtual? Philosophically, I would say it doesn't make much of a difference, at least no relevant difference. Some possible objections. First objection. The purpose in some computer games is to destroy virtual artifacts. Now, okay, if the purpose of some computer games is to destroy virtual artifacts, that purpose, if you like, call it the purpose of the game as a whole, at level 1, has a normative priority over the moral status of the artifacts within that game at level 2, which will grant, if you like, players the moral right to destroy artifacts if it's allowed by the morality of the game as a whole. So again, what determines whether virtual artifacts can or cannot be destroyed is the design in purposive agency. In this case, the design in purposive agency of the game overrides that of the individual artifacts, because because of its complexity. And I want to argue that what would override the moral status of something would depend on its higher capacity for purposive agency. The more complex a thing is, or an organism, the higher the moral status it has. And that the higher moral status is determined by its capacity for purposive agency. Now, the argument from Deepa gives equal moral standings to all entities. So one objection would be, well, human beings certainly have a higher moral status than a teacup or a toaster or a virtual sword. Sure. I think the argument allows that the higher capacity the higher capacity that human beings have for purposive agency, their complexity, gives them a higher moral status than a teacup or something which with a lesser capacity for purposive agency. But notice that the difference is one of degree. I want to say that there's in fact a moral continuum between human beings and artifacts, and that continuum allows for various degrees of moral consideration. Higher in human beings, maybe lower in amoebas, and for example, a software agent will have some moral status, which will become higher if the software agent reaches the status of an android, for example, like Data in Star Trek. By way of conclusion, I want to draw two general implications. There might be others, but at least two I have thought of. The world comprises a moral continuum consisting of different entities, both sentient and non-sentient, of varying degrees of moral status based on the level of their capacity for purposive agency. This is very much in keeping with Floridi's notion of an infosphere. And we can think of these entities, both the sentient and non-sentient, as information objects. In contrast to Floridi, though, recall, I made the basis of their moral consideration not that of being, which I think is problematic, but that of purposive agency, capacity for purposive agency. Second implication is that the moral difference between the real and the virtual, real and virtual entities, including virtual artifacts in computer games, is one of degree. As such, there is not in principle, I cannot say that there is in principle a moral difference in kind between the real and the virtual. An associated, perhaps, other implication is that this might have some further implications for the ontological differences between the real and the virtual. If there is no moral difference, perhaps that also impacts on the ontological consideration. Maybe there isn't any ontological, real or relevant difference between the real and the virtual. Thank you.
I have one question.
Sure.
What if the artifacts performs better than design? For example, we want to take a blunt knife because we're going to use it in a theater play. However, all we have is a sharp knife, which performs much better than design. So we blunt the knife. In this case, is that offense to the knife?
Well, it's a very good question. There's two things there. In you blunting the knife to use it in a theater production, you would be blunting the knife for a good reason. And also that your question also suggests that the purposive agency, the designing purposive agency, can change over time. I mean, you can use an artifact to do something else. So you might use a knife to cut, and you can also use a knife in a theater production, but you make it blunt so as to stop people getting cut. Nothing what I said basically goes against them. The purposive agency of the inherent purposive agency can change over time of an artifact. It's rather fluid. It's not stationary.
I was wondering about the difference between real and virtual. I think that there might just be a terminological issue because maybe there is no. I mean, maybe virtual artifacts are real artifacts.
Yeah.
They're just not physical. So maybe the difference might be between the virtual and the physical, as opposed to rather than real and virtual.
The difference might be between the.
The difference, the real difference, it would be between virtual and physical rather than virtual and real.
Yeah. Yeah, Espen, I could totally agree. Sorry, I didn't mean to misuse the word real.
Oh, I don't know.
No. I don't either. So I think, thank you. That's a good clarification. I think physical versus virtual would be better. Yeah.
Also, Kant used it in that way.
Sorry?
Real didn't mean physical in Kant's sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
No, in the back.
Non-sentient objects have a moral status regardless of an anthropocentric
Yeah.
view. Can you explain how?
All right. Well, because and this is where the point I made that it's partly anthropocentric in the sense it's based on the reasons for which we designed them. But also, once we design them, and the if you like, the artifact has built into it a certain capacity for purposive behavior, then in a way it acquires its own intrinsic value. For example, I won't be able to say that Mac, by destroying his own knife for no good reason, has done something wrong. If I couldn't say that, if it was purely, if the value, the moral status of the artifact was purely anthropocentric, maybe based purely on Mac's interest. But I can say that because it is, of course, initially anthropocentric in the sense that we design knives for that purpose, to suit our interest. But once the knife has been designed and it's been manufactured, then, if you like, it acquires a quasi-independence all of its own, because now it has, whether we decide to use it in that way or not, it has within it the capacity to be used that way. So it becomes quasi-independent. So because it becomes quasi-independent, it has, if you like, this. It has the instrumental value because we use it instrumentally to carry out certain functions, but it also has within it, inheres within it, an inherent intrinsic value, purely because of this designing purposive agency that we put into it.
You would say that moral status, or that value is in relation to other objects, it's relational, in a sense.
It's relational?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say that it's relational rather than intrinsic?
Well, it's the relation. The relation is between its instrumental value and its intrinsic value.
But I thought, in relation to other objects or to the context in which we're utilizing it.
How do you mean relational? So can you say that again? Can you explain it?
Well, the example of the theory equation.
Right.
It has another. It takes another form depending on the context in which we're using it, rather than it being.
All right. Yeah.
The design.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, I actually in the paper, the forthcoming paper for the International Journal of Technology and Human Interaction, I raised that as an objection against myself, and then made that objection. In a sense, yes. I mean, it is relational, but at the same time, it has like primary function. The primary function determines overall its intrinsic value. For example, a knife can be used for many different things, but it can be used to fly. you know what I mean? There's certain things we can use a knife for, but the primary function of for which it was designed was to cut. And that is the primary function, if you like, that determines its intrinsic value.
3 more questions.
I'd like to explore tension a little bit around the 2 propositions which are already the order of which I forgot. But one was that if something within a game is designed, say a building,
Yeah.
which can be destroyed, then it's okay.
Yes.
Okay, yes. To put it crudely.
Yes.
And the other one is that there is a sort of a scale from the minimal status of objects, inanimate objects, to I don't know, animals, androids,
Yes.
and so on.
Yeah.
So putting it, there is a tension there somewhere. If you go into World of Warcraft and play an undead character, and quite early in the game you come to Brill. Brill is a village
Right,
in the undead
right,
section
right,
of
right.
World of Warcraft. And there is an inn there. And in the cellar of the inn there is a dwarf, I think it's a dwarf, who one of the quests asks you to take a poisoned pumpkin. You know, an undead apothecary asks you, and this is for your character, this is the world you inhabit, this is what you do, this is where you are. And it's an optional quest. You can, as a player, have a choice to, you know, to give that pumpkin, or as I tend to do, is to ignore the quest completely. Now, the dwarf in the inn was designed specifically for the purpose for players to do that quest. It's designed to be poisoned. On the other hand, the dwarf is, it's not human, but it's a sort of, shall I say humanoid character, or, you know, I'm struggling for it, it's human-like
Yeah.
sentient being. So, between these 2 propositions, one of the scale, the minimal or maximum status, the dwarf is somewhat quite close to human, isn't it? Or same.
Well,
In terms of objects being designed to be poisoned
Yeah.
and killed. So how do you,
now, what would determine its higher moral status? Its capacity for purposive agents. I mean, artifacts have a moral status only as patients, not as agents, because their capacity to perform as agents is very minimal, and it's only according to its design and purposive agency. For example, a software agent is designed to carry out certain purposes, and some software agents are highly complex, and they have a certain minimal autonomy, and they can be even viewed as agents. But they're certainly not as complex as an Android would be, where an Android can program themselves. They can basically act totally autonomously as we do. And because of that higher capacity for purposive agency, an Android would have a higher moral status than the software agent.
are you talking actually about the
Sorry,
system
no,
or Android?
Yeah.
All right.
I have a question about game modding. It seems that under this rubric, someone in game modding makes modifications that may make the objects more useful, may just be completely arbitrary changes to objects in the game, might deform them, might make them useless. It seems like these creations, these acts, instead of being exploring possibilities of, you know, the software, etc., being, you know, creative. These modders are immoral under this structure, which I think is very strange. So my question is about how will game modding fit into this
Game modeling.
modding? Where you make individuals will make modifications that other players can download for their games. So in these modifications, you might have changes to armor, objects, weapons. You might make things more difficult. You might make things useless. I mean, can be very arbitrary. So what is the status of things like that?
Well, notice an important qualification, or an important overriding factor, which I didn't spend a lot of time talking about. I sort of mentioned it and I sort of moved on, is
It's be completely arbitrary too. They don't have to be for a good end. They don't have to be for a good purpose. They can be for either a bad reason or for absolutely, you know, a completely arbitrary.
yeah, but I mean, would that count as a good reason or not? I would say yes, it would count as a good reason. in contrast, I mean, it's a reason, it's a good reason. What's a good reason? It's a reasonable reason, a reason that most people, most reasonable people would accept as a good reason. I don't think, and now, for example, I'm going on this intuition that I don't think most of us would consider Mac's reason for destroying the knife on a whim as a good reason. I think it's just a waste of a good, perfectly good functional knife. Somebody who basically modifies a game and changes it has a good reason for doing so. I mean, maybe the reason is that it's going to make the game more fun, it's going to make the game more interesting, who knows. But, I mean, that would count as a good reason in my books. But, yeah.
Well, along this line, I wanted to touch on your term of for no good reason. So with that, because I wonder if you're leaning more towards the fact that Mac violated his knife because he had absolutely no reason. So you mean like he was irrational or whimsical, or was it that his reason wasn't good enough? Like maybe Mac likes defacing knives, but like you were saying now, most other reasonable people would say, no, that's not good enough.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a distinction between doing something for no reason at all and doing something for no good reason. And I think there is a relationship there. I mean, and this is why, for example, we find a crime that's been committed for what we can perceive as no reason at all more frightening than a crime that's been committed for a reason, even if we don't agree with the reason. Because something we can't understand, because there's no reason for it, is more, I think, more problematic for us than something which we can perhaps understand but not condone. I mean, that's why we say, well, I understand why he killed his wife because he was jealous of her lover, but I don't condone it. Or I understand that better than somebody who goes and kills his wife for no reason, for what we can conclude was no reason for killing her. So maybe there's, again, thank you for pointing that out, there might be a sort of a degree, a continuum, doing something for no reason which is worse than doing something for no good reason, which is bad, but not as bad as doing something for no reason whatsoever. And actually, I mean, just let me explain to you. My take on ethics, actually my background in ethics is Gewerthian, but it's also neo-Kantian in the sense that I, along with Gewerth and Kant and Aristotle and Plato, I believe that morality, ethics, is based on rationality. And the two are intricately connected. That's why...
To the point that you would also say like being irrational is immoral?
Being irrational is immoral. What?
Being irrational